Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership Podcast. And I'm delighted to have Colonel Casey Kim Campbell. Kim, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on. We've had a good chat already.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
No, well, it's lovely. And I have thoroughly enjoyed reading your book, Flying in the Face of Fear, about your lessons about courageous flying as an A-10 pilot in the old famous ground attack aircraft that we call the Warthog or the A-10. And I think those lessons there are very relevant for people both in the military, but a lot of them in business. And you're going around the world doing motivational speaking. So if people want to have you as a speaker after they've enjoyed this session, they should reach out to you. And I wish you every success with sharing the lessons that you've learned from your
Thank
successes,
you.
but also your mistakes.
Yep.
Talking of which, let's talk about your mistakes and my mistakes, because I think I've made more than you. But I loved listening when we were chatting to the fact we were talking about some of the key moments in your career as a pilot as you were going along. And when you started to make more mistakes was when you were focusing on the mistake you just made and you were really going through and giving yourself such a hard time that you were not then focusing on the next bit. I think you described it as focusing on the next 30 seconds rather than the last 30 seconds, because this is very relevant for so many leaders that they beat themselves metaphorically for a mistake they've made, and then things get worse. And then they get critical of everybody else because you can't like anybody else more than you like yourself. And if you're really being hard on yourself, you certainly get hard on others. What's your lesson really on this topic?
Well, first off, I love that you're starting with mistakes because I think sometimes we see a resume from somebody and of course, it's all the highlights, it's all the good things. But what you don't see is what's behind that and the mistakes and the failures and the struggles. And for me, that's where I've learned the most. That's where I've learned the most about myself. And this one lesson that you're talking about, I guess, thankfully happened very early in my flying career. Where I was flying a mission, and this was a formation flight where we fly in close proximity to another aircraft. It was one of my final evaluations in the program, so I have a little bit of confidence at this point. And then in the middle of the flight, my visor on my helmet starts to fog up, which is probably because I'm breathing hard and I'm nervous. And it gets to the point where it's a little unsafe to be that close to another airplane. And, I'm worried about how I'm flying. And I tell the instructor in the back seat, all of this is good right now. And he says, no problem. I have the airplane. He takes it and moves away. He says, clean your visor and get back in. Like, not a big deal, right? I do that. I get back in. But instead of thinking about what I'm doing and kind of what's coming up, I'm like in the past 30 seconds, worried about how I was flying, the mistakes that I made when my visor was fogging up. And I'm not thinking about what I'm doing. So what happens? I continue to make mistakes. It now snowballs because now I'm not flying well because I'm not in the present. I'm not in the moment. I'm not thinking about what I'm doing. I'm behind, kind of beating myself up about how I have flown. It turns out to be the worst ride that I ever flew in the program, my entire time at training. We landed, we walked into the debrief room, and my instructor said, Casey, you're a good pilot, but that was a terrible ride. And I knew it, right? I knew it. And he looked at me, he said, you have to learn to let it go. He said, you make a mistake, you learn from it, and you don't do it again, and you let it go. And it was such, like these are things that I knew, but I just found myself overwhelmed by critiquing myself in the moment, which I think is so relevant for many times throughout my career. And I go back to that initial lesson. I go back to just let it go, learn the lesson so you don't do it again, but you've got to be able to let it go. We're so hard on ourselves as leaders. We are going to make mistakes. We are going to do things that don't go the way we want them to. We have to learn from them, but we have to be able to let it go and move on.
Yeah. I think this whole thing about compartmentalization and time slots is really interesting. My first sort of what triggered from what you were just saying there, Casey, was the fact that we do need to move on and perform highly, sort of optimal performance rather than peak performance, which is for a bit and then it drops away. You're really looking for this optimal performance, right? And going back and and beating yourself up over what's happened in the past doesn't help. However, as you know, and you used to do the same, and we did in the military, was this after action review, where you do need to look back at what you've done in the cool of, when the intense moment is over. What went well, what would make it even better, or some use GDD, what was good, what was difficult, what should we do differently, but to learn from our past mistakes. And I think there's another category of what I call expiring leaders or misleaders, not the inspiring leaders, who never learn from the past in the after action reviews. And they go, oh, it wasn't my fault. It was her fault, his fault. The fingers are pointing everywhere else other than this was my response, my accountability, my responsibility. I can do this better next time. I need to learn from this, or whatever was going on. So I think that's one to, it's not what you're saying, but I think it's a sort of lesson that follows on from that, the after action review. And the second one was, the second one was a Navy SEAL I had on in a forthcoming podcast, which I've just recorded recently. And he was in charge of, I think they call it the Green Team. Their Navy SEALs are already elite, but they're in this DevOps specialist group. And to get into this, they've got to do another 6 months of training. And they were finding that certain people were failing this who were really skilled. But it was about the attributes that they had and the fact that they were overthinking how long they got. Oh, I've got to do, 6 months. Oh, God, and how am I going to pace myself? And they lost concentration there. And the fact that you actually do it in small chunks, maybe even 10-minute chunks. I can do the next 10 minutes. This is really tough. Or some of the tough moments you had over Baghdad and things like that. Let's just go through the next 10 minutes and then the next 10 minutes. And I found when I was doing airborne selection, that they were beasting me, and particularly as an officer, they wanted to make life utterly miserable for me to see if I would give up and ring the bell and just give in. And I found my way of doing it was to compartmentalize it. I didn't realize that this was a generally good practice. And that's really the only way you can get through difficult times. But isn't that a pretty useful lesson for everybody listening, that probably I expect you've used? Do you want to say a bit about how you've compartmentalized to cope with just the stress?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very valuable technique in the moment, right? When you're in something, whether it's a flight over Baghdad, whether it's a negotiation or a critical meeting, and something didn't go well, you got to tuck that away, like acknowledge that, compartmentalize it so you're not overthinking it and you're not dwelling on it, but you've got to open it up later. And that's the key. I think sometimes we're like, I'm going to compartmentalize that. Don't want to think about that right now because I need to focus on the present. Very realistic, very helpful thing to do in the moment, but we've got to do the debrief. And that's really the key. We've got to be able to unpack that later and deal with it, whether it's, a personal issue or whether it's, a mistake that happened. We need to be able to talk about it. And as you said, to do that effectively as a team, there has to be an environment of trust, right? Where people feel safe to provide feedback without blame, without shame, because the easy answer in a lot of these after actions and a lot of these debriefs, the easy answer is we're just going to blame somebody. We're just going to blame somebody. We're not going to drill down into the root cause. And that is the key part of a debrief is you've got to drill down into the root cause of that mistake so that you can pull the lesson and then do it differently the next time. So it's absolutely critical. You're in the moment, compartmentalize it for now, but you've got to be able to unpack that and walk through it and really drill down into why did that happen? What did we learn? And what are we going to do differently the next time?
Beautifully put. And I think this brings up this concept of psychological safety, that if you have an environment of fear and intimidation and bullying, where people feel it's not safe to admit that you ever make a mistake. One of my friends in America, Jeff Nishwitz, he gave me three terms to check if you got psychological safety. 10 words, 3 phrases. Phrase 1, I was wrong. Phrase 2, I don't know. And phrase 3, I need some help. Brilliant, really. And if you think about the worst leaders, the misleaders that you've worked for, I know, speaking for myself, they would never say any of those 3 words. And we can think of certain politicians in the UK and the US who would never use words like that. And therefore, we really not trust them or respect them because they would cover up and they would essentially make it all about everybody else, never their own learning. And so they don't evolve. They just stay in their own narcissistic little shell. But I think it's really interesting this point about when you have made a mistake, how you can feel safe enough to talk about it. And there was a lovely example recently in I know Boeing's had their problems recently where people were covering certain mistakes up and things like this. But there was a different aircraft manufacturer where one of the engineers working on the engine of one of the aircraft was driving home and he realized, oh no, I've left one of my own tools in the engine cowling. And this was a big passenger airliner. So he rang up and said, my mistake. I've left it there. Please don't let that aircraft take off. He drove back. He showed them where it was, found it, retrieved it. Now, it was his own tool. And if it had been one of their tools, of course, he'd have to put it back in. But they had such a poor process when they did the after action review that they didn't have the right tools. And it was so laborious to sign things out that the whole process made them bring their own tools, and then their own tools weren't checked and so on. But the point was they didn't sack him. They actually celebrated the fact that he was talking about a mistake he made, because he could have easily not said anything. The thing would have gone in. It might have become FOD on the aircraft, caused another aircraft to crash. That one could have gone down. And we'll talk about malfunctions to aircraft later on. Let's talk a bit about your own experience. April the 7th, 2003. I think it's a huge lesson in Stoic philosophy, which I know you have followed, and I'm a great believer in it. But this is firsthand. Do you want to tell us what was happening as you were flying over Baghdad? Do you want to just take the story from there?
Sure. Yeah. So back April 7th, 2003, flying a close air support mission over Baghdad, supporting our ground troops, which was our mission every day. A little bit more high threat once we got up to Baghdad. Unfortunately, that day the weather was cloudy all over Baghdad, and for us in the A-10 at the time, we needed to be able to get below the weather to support our ground troops. We got an immediate call over the radio, really, as soon as we arrived, that our ground troops were taking fire. They needed immediate assistance, and we were going to do everything we could to get down there and help them out. So we got down below the weather, and I could instantly see this firefight. I mean, there were bright flashes and smoke and tracers going back and forth across the Tigris River. And we talked very quickly with my flight lead and I and had a plan. And we did a couple passes of gun and rockets. We knew it was a high threat situation. So we were just going to do a few passes, kind of climb up and reassess. And rolling in on my last rocket pass, everything goes normal. I climb out, just trying to climb up, get my altitude and airspeed back. And then I hear this loud explosion at the back of the airplane. And I know immediately I'm hit. I mean, the jet noses over, pointing down at Baghdad below. I instinctively just kind of pull back on the control stick and nothing happens. I mean, now the ground is starting to get closer and I know I might have to eject, but that's not something that I want to do. So I quickly fall back on my training. I've got, master caution light flashing at me. I've got my whole caution panel that's lit up. And I quickly kind of analyze and I see that my hydraulic lights are on. I look up at my hydraulic gauges and they're at 0. And hydraulics are how we control our airplane. So now I'm plunging to the ground, which, kind of out of control at this point. I look down again at my ejection handles and think, it's about the last thing I want to do is potentially eject into the hands of the enemy. And so I mean, at this point, I just know I have to make every second count. And I set aside my fear and I just focus on taking action, getting control of this airplane. Thankfully, on the A-10, we have a backup emergency system. I was able to flip that switch, and thankfully, the airplane responded and started climbing up and away from Baghdad. And that was kind of the first moment of like, okay, I might just make it out of here alive. And then I had to fly the airplane home.
Yeah.
Which was probably the hardest. This was like the initial shock.
Mm.
And now it was kind of the long-term, how am I going to do this?
Yeah. Yeah. It must have been a very emotional moment then. I can almost see it in your face. I can see you reliving it.
Yeah. It was probably the most terrifying moment of my life. I think, I think in life, I don't know, I guess you think that some of those things aren't going to happen to you. You talk about them, we plan for them, we brief for them, we do simulators for them, but you're kind of like, that's not actually going to happen to me. And then it does. And for me, in a single seat airplane, like there's nobody there to help me. I mean, yes, I have a wingman, but in that moment, it's me. I have to be able to fall back on my training, to make a very time critical decision, to focus on critical priorities, to shut out all of those things, right? To compartmentalize. Like, I know there are so many things going wrong that could go wrong. I have to focus on what is most important, which is get my airplane under control.
Yeah.
Everything else really at this point is secondary.
Yeah.
And, I was able to do it in that moment, despite the fear, despite the risk, despite the uncertainty, I was able to take action.
And I think this is where all the months and years of training and drills. I think of moments when I was terrified and frightened, whether it be counterterrorism against the IRA or working in Bosnia on operations or whatever it is. When something goes wrong, you click into a drill, a procedure, might be certain things you do that you go through a list of things to do. Because what happens, they say, is the front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, goes blank. The blood is pouring to your limbs and your heart. It's not helping your brain think well. In fact, all you're trying to think of is freeze. It's freeze first. My God, the beast won't notice me if I stay still. Flight, I'm going to run away from this fearful thing and then turn and fight in the last thing. But they're all melded together, and the adrenaline, the cortisol surges around you, and you actually stop thinking well. In the worst cases, you void your body and all sorts of things like that go on. People do that in moments of fear. But this is why we have all these drills that we go through. People think they're a bit laborious, and why do you do all this? But all the training that you did, everything was preparing you for that moment. And thank God you did survive. I mean, you had 600 holes in your aircraft. I mean, that was a huge missile strike. And if you hadn't had such a beast of a groundhog, a warthog, any other aircraft would have gone down. And I have so much respect when working with A10 pilots like you, because you came in and shared our pain. You were flying. Many pilots are way up there, drop bombs, head off home. Yeah, but actually, when you get talking to them, it's a whole different story. But let's come back to that. But you guys share the pain and know what it's like to be the infantry soldier on the ground like I was, and what goes on and the help that we need. And God, it was a wonderful, powerful beast. It's interesting, of course, you didn't experience what a chap I'm going to get on the podcast coming shortly. Have you ever came across a pilot called John Peters? John got shot down in the Iraq War. He was a tornado pilot, and he was taken prisoner and tortured. And his story is a very powerful one. And he also is a very inspiring motivational speaker like you are. But I'm looking forward to talking to John, because, of course, that was what you didn't want to happen. It was highly likely you might have to eject to live into Baghdad, into the middle of the Iraqi forces, who would do all sorts of things. Heaven knows what happens if they catch a female pilot, let alone a male pilot. They wouldn't have any respect for you, less respect. So you were so lucky to get back. And am I right? You got a Distinguished Flying Cross for your operation, for the action that day and bringing the aircraft home.
I
Tell us
did,
about
yeah.
that, and going to collect that.
Well, I mean, I think there's, for me, I mean, I was doing my job, right? This is what any A-10 pilot would do. We would take risks to support our troops on the ground. Like you said, we have a bond with ground troops that I think is a little bit different. I mean, we meet with our ground troops and brief with them and debrief with them when we can. I think there's just an understanding. We educate ourselves on ground scheme and maneuver. And so I think there's this special bond. So for me, I felt like I was very much just doing my job in terms of the close air support that we provided that day over Baghdad. I don't know, flying the airplane home certainly was the hardest thing I ever had to do. Some of the most difficult decisions I ever had to make in an hour time span. And, landing that airplane successfully, bringing it back to base. To me, it was, I guess I look at all the people that have received distinguished flying crosses and I feel very humbled, to be in that crowd, to be in that
Yeah,
crowd of people.
it's a very small group,
Yeah. And so
and this is go on. Sorry.
standing in front of the pilots and the maintainers and receiving that award, I guess the best word I can think of it, I just felt very humbling.
Yeah,
Very, very honored
yeah.
to be part of that group.
And that is what is so lovely about the guests on the Inspiring Leadership podcast is they often, like you do, well, maybe not me, there's somebody else, or I'm not inspiring leader. And I get really worried when I'm God's gift and I'm so fantastic. And I get some people who say, I'm so inspiring, I should be on your podcast. And you go, I don't think you get the idea. This is recommendations for people to be on the podcast. Other people say they're inspiring. It's a bit like someone saying, I'm a really funny comedian. No, you don't get to choose that. Your audience gets to decide if you're a funny comedian. And just like your troops, who you led, your airmen and your airwomen, they get to decide if you're a good leader, if you're an inspiring leader. Not that you stand up there on a podium and look down at the crowd and say, "I'm really inspiring." And they go, "Okay, yeah, you're very humble too, aren't you?" I think part of the inspiring leader's success that I find, and I've now done some 350, and that is humbling and very exciting, the kind of different people that I meet, whether they're explorers or triple amputees or CEOs or parliamentarians or whatever it might be, their background. It's very inspiring. They're different stories, but there's quite a common theme, which is one or both parents were great role models. Now, your upbringing, you had several firsts in your career, but you were also one of the first father-daughter duos serving as Cadet Wing commanders at the Air Force Academy, which is like the top sort of job among all the cadets. I was at the military academy at Sandhurst. I was in the cadet government, but I never got that top role, which you did. Tell us a bit about the sort of upbringing and how it's shaped your leadership philosophy, your father's example, your mother, and just how that's shaped who you are today.
Well, I decided in 1986 at age 10 that I was going to be a fighter pilot. And my parents never told me that in 1986 that women were not allowed to be fighter pilots. That was the rule at the time. They told me to work hard and go after what I wanted. So I think, that that motivation in itself was important of just, all right, you want something, you're going to have to work for it. It's not going to be easy. And my dad knew that if I was going to go do this fighter pilot role, many of the pilots obviously come out of the Air Force Academy. So he said, you might consider the Air Force Academy. I don't know that they actually thought I would go through with it at the point, right? When I was 10, they were kind of like, okay, work hard, go after what you want. I don't think they actually thought I was going to go through with it. But once I kind of committed to it, my dad supported me the whole way. My mom did as well. My dad was the one that was, he said, all right, if you want to go to the Air Force Academy, you need to be ready. You need to be prepared. So we're going to install a pull-up bar in your bathroom and you can do pull-ups every time you go in and out of the bathroom to work on the upper body strength. He was the one that was running hills in my hometown in combat boots to get those broken in. So it was like a support, encouragement, but also challenging me. Like, if I'm going to go do this, we're going to do it right. And they really pushed me to be at my best, which, I'm grateful for. They've been my biggest supporters, my role models, my heroes. They've been there for me through the ups and downs. And so I think parents certainly have a critical role in helping their kids on their journeys and helping them go after those goals and dreams that can be big and lofty, but you got to put in the work. And my parents really reinforced that with me.
Yeah, and which takes us now to yourself and your husband Scott, who you met. He was in the Navy. He was a Navy pilot, like my father, and you met, fell in love. Luckily, you had to wait until you weren't serving together, which was quite a tricky, challenging one to have. But now you got children, and of course, they're going to be looking to you and Scott as role models. And you and I discussed Scott coming on as your guest because you find him an inspiring leader as well, not just because he's your husband, but in his own right. So what examples or what lessons, if there was a couple of lessons you've taught your kids already, do you hope that they're learning from you?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I, um, try so hard. I think about the things that I would go back and tell myself. And now, here are my kids. And I think the thing that I want them to know is that you are going to fail at times. You're going to make mistakes. So you have to be able to get back up again. Don't be so hard on yourself. And that's one of those things. It's like, how do you help your kids go do hard things, knowing that they may fail, knowing that they will make mistakes? Both of my kids play soccer, football. They sometimes they don't have a great game. My son is a goalkeeper, and he, it's almost sometimes like your kids teach you things too. I asked him as a goalkeeper, which is a really hard position for a parent to watch. And I asked him, I said, if you get scored on, like, how do you learn from that? And what do you do? And he said, well, Mom, I'm pretty mad when it happens. My son is almost 12. He said, Mom, I'm pretty mad when it happens. But once the ball goes back to midfield and we kick it off, we start again, I have to let it go. And I don't think about it anymore. And I was like, man, if you're 12 and you're telling me this, like, these are things that I'm still learning. Now, granted, these are, things that we like to reinforce, but I just think sometimes we're so hard on ourselves when we make those mistakes. And how do we help our kids get to the point that it's taken me, 20, 30 years to get to?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think from the wisdom of babes and small children, we get some amazing lessons. I remember Bryony, who's now 30 and just had a daughter, Lyra, who's 6 weeks old. And I remember her it could have been her, it could have been my other daughter, Harriet. But they said to me when they were tiny, Daddy, how are you? And I said, I'm fine. I'm okay. And they went, no, Daddy, how are you really? And I thought, whoa, these ones have got high emotional touch. They're
Yeah.
reading me. Yeah, I'm upset. Okay, who are you upset with, Daddy? Well, someone at work was pretty unpleasant to me, and I had a really bad day with them. Okay, Daddy, what are you going to do now? I thought, whoa, I'm getting coached
Yeah.
from
I
a
love
little one.
it.
But that level of just genuinely picking up and knowing that the first response they're getting isn't a real response and there's something more behind it, that's powerful.
Yeah,
So let's take it
sure.
on to your book, Flying in the Face of Fear, fighter pilot lessons about leading with courage. And certainly you've had to do that in a whole range of different roles. But you get asked to a lot of businesses to talk about your experiences, and particularly they want the top lessons that you can apply to business. Now, I'm sure that's a whole talk in itself, but if you were to pick out a couple of lessons that you find really land well with your audiences and they go, yeah, that's me too, because that's what you want. You want your audience to go, me too. Yeah, that's an issue that we do have in our business. What do you find are the sort of top couple of ones that they go, that is a problem in our business, or that is a problem with our leaders, or as a leader, I don't deal with that. What would you have your top two?
I think a lot of the things that I find that people are asking questions about now is, how do we prepare for uncertainty? How do we prepare to face challenges and hard times? And I go back to that mission that I flew in Iraq in 2003 because I've had some time to reflect. It's been 20 years, and I think about, sometimes it's almost surreal. Like, how was I able to make a decision at the time that was really a life or death decision and feel confident in it, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, and despite the risk? And I really go back to, I look at it as a checklist for me now. It's prepare, practice, plan for contingencies. Before that mission, before the deployment, I prepared by studying my aircraft systems. I knew it would happen if they failed. I also studied enemy threat systems, right? I knew their strengths and weaknesses. I practiced, by using a visualization technique in the aviation world called chair flying. I visualized myself in the cockpit and how I would respond, things that I would do. And then I took it that third step and planned for contingencies. I didn't just think about what happens when everything goes right. I also took the time to think through what happens when things go wrong. I think that same concept of prepare, practice, plan for contingencies, it works in business, it works in life. I mean, think about difficult decisions or challenges, complex projects. we have to take the time to prepare by seeking out lessons learned. Look at past debriefs and after action reviews. What has worked or hasn't worked in the past? And
Oh,
then practice,
I
right?
think there's a really good prepare, practice, plan for contingency. And indeed, there was the Exxon Valdez where the great disaster happened and all the oil spill. And when they started to analyze it, they went, did you plan for contingency? Did you plan for what if this went wrong? Oh, well, we just assumed there's a very small chance of that happening. All
Right.
these factors coming together, which would lead to the ship. So we couldn't afford to do it. It was just too expensive to build the ship to those kind of specs. Well, of course, as you say, if you think education is expensive, try the cost of ignorance, and the cost of them not doing that was massive. And I think this is something, and you and I were talking about Admiral William McRaven, who you and I both like his book, The Wisdom of the Bullfrog, and we were talking about the fact I'm chatting to him in about 2 hours' time, and he was saying in discussion the fact that when they planned for the capture or killing of Osama bin Laden, they thought of all the contingencies. What if this goes wrong? What if we're detected on the border going into Pakistan? What if we detected an hour into going into Pakistan? What if we detected 2 hours in? Every single situation they had to have a contingency plan for, because when it actually happens to you, there's so much crises going on and your brain gets flooded and the freeze, flight, fight comes and you blur, you can't think well. But if look at the list, what's the contingency? Do this. And you don't actually have to then go through the agonizing process of trying to churn through when the brain's not working well. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think, if you think through those contingencies, you're better equipped in the moment, right? To handle the fear, the stress, the worry, the doubt, because you've thought about them before. I mean, I find this with my personal life as well. Like when I start feeling worried or nervous about something coming up, whether it's a difficult conversation or a big presentation, you name it, I go back to the same prepare, practice, plan for contingencies. And what I find is that when I think through those contingencies, like what am I worried about going wrong? Yeah, I may still be a little nervous in the moment if it happens, but I've thought through it. I have a plan of action, and it just gives me so much more confidence to deal with it in the moment.
Yeah, and this is where back to the actual stoic lesson from your missile strike is it's not the fact you had the problem, it's how you handled it that led to them giving you the Distinguished Flying Cross. Because it would have been so easy just to bail out, you know, but you were fighting it back, and not only were you fighting it back from what you were saying when I listened to your book, which is a great listen, I must say, and I do recommend it. It was such a physically demanding battle to control manually what was
Mhm.
normally done automatically. And thank God they designed this aircraft to have this manual, although it was a pig to literally a warthog to fly this thing. There was some contingency built into it, duplication and redundancy, which many aircraft don't have, which allowed you to live and survive, because you may not have lived if you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it was also, obviously this incredible airplane, but I remembered the stories of the pilots who came before me, which is why I think it's so important to share our stories, to share the lessons we've learned. It's why you have this podcast. It's the sharing of stories to help others on their journey.
Hmm.
I had heard stories of pilots that came before me who flew in manual reversion, attempted to land in manual reversion. And sadly, they were not all successful.
Hmm.
And even the fatalities that came from it, we learned those lessons so that the pilots that came after, people like me, could be here to talk about it. And I think when we share our stories, we share the lessons, even if they expose some mistakes or weaknesses, those stories, the lessons have the ability to help others on their journey.
And that really touches on something deep to me about a life purpose and why I do the work I do with this free podcast, which I give for the benefit of communities. By having leaders like you who share your inspiring leadership lessons, the mistakes you've made, the things that have gone well, you in turn will influence and touch the lives of people that you and I may never meet these people, but they will take something from your story and they will adapt it and apply it to their own life. And one day it may help them succeed in a role, may even save their life. because of the way they think about it. So I find, I don't know whether that chimes for you, but I find that deeply empowering, that we haven't got time to go and talk to everybody. So if you can talk to a few very powerful groups of senior leaders who in turn will cascade lessons that you give them, that would be great. What would be, after preparing for uncertainty, what would be the second one that really resonates with your audiences when you're a motivational speaker?
I think sometimes it's a bit of a surprise for people because, here I am, I'm talking about being a fighter pilot in this, kind of high intensity story. But I share a story in my keynotes about my son. And it's the one that seems to resonate with people the most. To me, it's a story of connection and trust and how we build that with a team. And this is at my very first change of command ceremony before I take command, very formal ceremony. And in the middle of the ceremony, my son is sitting in the front row, and I kind of give him a little smile, and I can tell he's just bored out of his mind. He's 3. And so he decides, he kind of looks at me, smiles back, and he stands up. And then he starts taking these slow steps, like very sneakily. He's invisible because he's moving so slowly. He's moving to the stage. While he's doing this, like, my mind is racing, my heart is pounding because I'm like, what is he doing? I'm looking at my husband thinking, you should probably do something. And he's like, I'm not doing anything, because we potentially could have like this full-blown meltdown here in front of everybody. My son doesn't care about any of this. He eventually makes his way up to the stage, comes up and sits in my lap in the middle of this very formal ceremony. He's so content. He's like, I'm good. What's the problem here? And yet I am terrified of what my team is thinking of me. I mean, certainly not proper military protocol, but I just have this realization in the middle of this ceremony. I'm looking at my son and I realize, you know what? This is me. And I want my team to see me for who I am, right? I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm a fighter pilot, I'm a leader, I'm all of these things. And this is the human side of leadership. It's this idea that we can be strong and we can be compassionate at the same time. We can be tough and we can be kind. And it took my 3-year-old son in the middle of the ceremony to teach me that. What I also realized after this, when I started talking to my young airmen, like, this was the highlight for them. Like, it made me human, and it connected me with them in a way that I'm not sure anything else could have. And it just taught me that to be vulnerable, to open yourself up, to give trust and show people who you are is so critical. It's the foundation of trust.
I absolutely loved that story when listening about it in your book, and really related to it, because I think too often, I'm a world-class speakers coach to some of my leaders. I try and give them tips and techniques. And one of the CEOs I was working with, he's very intelligent, very, very clever man. But he was very wooden. And people couldn't relate to him. They just thought he was like a robot. He was like, some kind of machine, and they couldn't relate to him. And I said, tell me a story about something that's really dear to your heart. He said, well, people won't know, but I leave the office at 5, always on the dot. He said, because I need to go home and look after my son, because he has epileptic fits every day. And some of them are so severe that he will potentially die from those attacks. I don't know whether I'm going to see him tomorrow, whether he'll be alive. And I said, and you've not told anybody that? He said, no. I said, well, tell them that story. I said, it gets me even now, just him sharing that. And there was this robot who just said, you may wonder, what matters to me, and it's family matters to me. And this is why you might see me leaving at 5, but I'll work later on. But it's because I don't know whether I'm going to see my son again tomorrow. And there was not a dry eye in the place. It really touched people. And from that moment, people were prepared to work so much harder for him and his organization, because he was being authentic. It wasn't an act. He wasn't putting it on. He just told a real story. And I've never forgotten it. It was like 15 years ago. I go back to that moment, being in the audience, and you could just see people. And afterwards, they came up to him in huge numbers all over the place. And they just said, thank you for just showing that it's okay to be strong enough to be vulnerable. And I
Yeah.
don't think people think that vulnerability is a good thing at all. They've been taught, don't, it's not safe. It's not psychologically safe. Don't show weakness because they will stab you, they will kill you, they will run you down, they will think you're worse, you won't get promoted, whatever it is. And I, having been brought up with boarding school and the military and things like that, it was never safe. You put the mask on, and it's only now in my 60s that I can be happy crying if I need to about something that touches me. Which takes me on to male machismo. One of the courses that I did was an American-based program called the Mankind Project, trying to get men to grow up to be kind and to be appropriately vulnerable in a world of toxic masculinity. And the armed forces has traditionally, and certainly when I was there, it was a very much a macho environment. There weren't, when I first went in, there weren't any women at all. My first wife actually was one of the very early army officers, and we were married for 23 years. Um, and it was very hard for her to get on in that very macho male environment. They would do things like, as she arrived as a new troop commander, they'd put doilies and little lace curtains in her office and pink pens and all this kind of stuff. And like, you wouldn't do that to a male officer. You know, why are you doing this? And just little things to just make them into girls rather than women, to belittle them so that their opinion didn't kind of matter. Now you've, been a female pilot in a predominantly male field. Often when you were certainly at war, you were just the only female pilot. There probably wasn't even facilities for a woman toilet or anything like that, or a shower or your own bit of the tent where all the guys are together. But you got through it. So I just wonder, with women coming through now, what's your advice about how they can handle it from your own experience?
Well, I think the number one thing is to be credible and be good at what you do. When I walked into my fighter squadron on day one, I knew I was going to be the only female pilot. And I put a ton of pressure on myself. I mean, I personally felt like if I made a mistake or if I failed, that I would ruin it for the women that followed me, which is a ton of pressure.
Yeah.
The good part of that is that I worked really hard to be good at what I was doing. And the reality is that in flying, the jet doesn't know the difference. And it really turned out that the guys in my squadron didn't care about the difference either, as long as I was credible and capable in the airplane. So that's the number one thing I think is go in, be credible, be good at what you do. I also think it helps to have allies, people that will stand up for you and speak up for you. I think, I had a hard time as a young pilot, initially kind of standing up for myself and speaking out against things. But I also learned that if I could dish it back in the way that, that actually gained respect in many ways. And so I learned to be more confident in that. But it was certainly nice if there was a guy in the squadron that would do the same for me. The other thing I would say is sometimes we have to find our allies or our supporters outside of our team, the specific team that we're in. And so for me, that was finding another group of female fighter pilots that were dealing with much the same thing, felt some of the same issues, and just to kind of have an outlet, a safe space, if you will, to talk about some of those things. So I think all of those things help, but really, for me, more than anything, if there's anything that came out of that mission, and there's a lot of things, but one of the things that came out of that mission, early combat mission over Baghdad, was that I proved myself in combat very early in my career. I mean, I was a young wingman when that happened, and I proved myself in combat. And it was like from then on out, there was no question. It was just, that was like a non-issue.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think
Well,
that's a critical piece.
yeah. Well done on that. The other thing is, and I'm sure you talk about this in your talks and your lectures with different groups, decision making and risk taking is quite a problem in business. They often don't make decisions swiftly enough, that the process is a bit wobbly and all over the place, and people feel left out of decisions, or the boss makes a decision and then the next person to get to him or her can change their opinion and they go back on that decision, or they're not quite sure what the decision is, or no decision is made. Risk taking, there's not much analysis done of what the risks are, or what kind of processes, simple processes for the audiences listening around the world, would you share around decision making and risk taking that has you've taken from one to the other, from the military to business?
Yeah, I think again, I go back to a little bit of preparation. I think you got to put in the work, you got to do the research. I think when time is available, you seek input from outside sources, right? It goes back to, I need some help making this decision. I recognize that as a leader, for me, you know, as a group commander, I was responsible for 1,000 personnel throughout South America, Central America, the Caribbean. I had a wide range of people that worked for me, and I was not the expert. So making decisions about some of those things, I absolutely had to put in the work. I had to do the research. I had to seek outside input to listen to other experts. I'm going to listen as much as I can. We're going to plan for contingencies, right? We're going to think about, okay, what are the things that can go wrong here? But at some point, you need to make a decision, right? That's why you're a leader, is they're expecting you to make decisions. And you're never, I can probably say you're never, and feel confident in that, you're likely never going to have 100% perfect information. And so you make the best decision you have. You include people from the team to help you make that decision. Again, assuming time is available, and you make the decision. You execute. And if it's a bad decision or if it's the wrong decision, you admit it, you go back and you readjust. I mean, it just, sometimes we get in this, we're afraid to make the decision. The reality is that our team wants a decision. They want to be able to move forward and move out. And in that stage where they don't have a confident decision from a leader, it's frustrating for a team.
Yeah.
And so you've got to be able to make the decisions when you don't have perfect information.
And also, you have had a fascinating career. One of the amazing jobs you had working in the Pentagon was for the now Secretary of the Army, Christine. Do you want to just say about that and how you saw her as a female inspiring leader, because she was someone you wanted to recommend, how you saw her make decisions and what you took at the time?
So very fascinating. I spent my career flying A-10s, and now I'm at the Pentagon. I'm working for, at the time, Christine Wormuth was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, essentially the number 3 on the policy side of the house in the Pentagon. And now I'm looking at this very strategic level and watching her make decisions that have significant impact across the military, across defense, meeting with our very senior leaders from other nations as well. She really set the example for me in so many ways of how to make a decision, to be confident in a decision, but also, here I am, a colonel in the Air Force. I've served about 20 years at this point, and she's asking me my opinion on things. She recognizes as a senior civilian leader, she wants my opinion as a military leader. To sit in and on these meetings and know that my opinion has value, like that gave me so much confidence in myself. And I think that just, when you look at a leader like that is willing to just turn to somebody younger, less experienced, and to say, hey, what do you think about this? I mean, that did wonders in terms of my confidence, but also that shows that humility, right? That vulnerability of you're willing to listen and learn from the people on your team. So it's no doubt to me that she, why she has moved up and is now the Secretary of the Army. She also set an incredible example, just being a role model as a woman leader, the first woman that I ever worked for in my career.
Yeah, well, you've triggered in me that sense of strength through vulnerability. But one of the other Navy SEAL mottos, which is really powerful, is 3 words: I need you. Now, that shows you have respect for the other, that you value them, but it also shows that you're not perfect, and that trust based on admitting that you do need some help. It's a slight variation on the other one, but I think I love that one. And so you're also, I think, the visiting professor at, do I pronounce it rightly, Reichman University?
I did 2
Okay.
weeks there as a visiting professor, teaching leadership and security.
And you've done lots of teaching on leadership. So let's talk about people who are not in the military. Maybe a couple more lessons that you would say went down well with them, and they think, yeah, that's really useful. I found that helpful. What else, if you gave a couple more?
Yeah. Well, your 3 words there kind of triggered a thought in terms of the 3 words that I look at in leadership. And it's these 3 words are ones that you wouldn't expect maybe coming from a fighter pilot, but it's what we teach at our weapons school. And it's humble, approachable, credible.
Oh,
And to me, it's right. You expect the credibility piece, right? We need to be credible. We need to be capable. We need to be good at what we do, but we also need to be humble and approachable. We need to be willing to get out and talk to our team, find out, what they value, where do they struggle, what can we do to help. It's encouraging our team members to bring their ideas to the table. We often find that some of the most creative and innovative ideas come from the members of our team, but you won't find out unless you engage with them, unless you're vulnerable and put yourself out there and show that you are humble and you're willing to listen and learn. You're approachable so people feel like they can come share those things with you. But being a humble, approachable, and credible leader, to me, those three words are very, very critical. And it's a great way to look at leadership, whether you're a new emerging leader or you're a highly experienced leader.
I love that one. And funny enough, I was going to discuss with you having a few friends of mine who are pilots, and they actually they have a good sense of humor. So this one helps, and they can laugh at themselves. And they go, "How do you know there's a fast jet pilot at a cocktail party?"
They'll
And
tell you.
the reply is, they'll tell you that they're a fast jet pilot at a cocktail party.
Yeah.
Then, of course, you've got the other people who are the what we call the Walter Mitties, who've either been in the SAS or the Navy SEALs, or they're a fast jet pilot. And a very quick conversation with Colonel K.C. Campbell will show that they haven't got a clue about how to fly anything, let alone been in special forces. But the three ones I like is the three hums, which came from a friend of mine, Roger Steer. I don't know where Roger got it from, but humility, humanity, and humor. That this thing about it is really important for people who are very successful, and that's what's so attractive about someone like Admiral McRaven. Is he actually, even though he was a four-star general and Navy SEAL and all the things about Osama bin Laden and Captain Phillips and Saddam, he's still very humble. I wanted a photograph from him. He could send me a picture with him with a chest full of medals. What did he send me? He sent me a picture of him in a suit. And I thought, okay, I know you're retired, but that's really a sort of signal of I'm not the big I am. And I think the humility, humanity, you talked about humanity as well, and a nice touch of humor. If we take, I know for myself, part of my own development over the years, any of the officers I had who gave my report, Jonathan, don't take yourself so seriously. You just lighten up a little bit, Don't be so competitive with your peer group. Oh God, I know I was, and if I'd had that humility, humanity, and humor, a bit of advice, I'd realize that particularly the more I told people how wonderful I was, the less they believed it. The more I tell people how wonderful Colonel Kim Campbell is, the more they'll believe that you are. But you can't tell them that you're great. It's like trying to be, I'm a very funny comedian. And so just you learn a lot of these lessons late in life. There's a New York Jewish saying, which is too soon old, too late smart. And that we get old, but we don't get smart quick enough. We're close to the end of our time, which is such a shame. It's gone very quickly. A couple of questions, and then we'll go into the your book recommendation and your top tip. But advice to aspiring leaders looking back at your career. If you could go back, your children are going to be this age soon. 16 to 18 years old. What would you say? This matters. This doesn't. If you went back and met KC Campbell, and by the way, tell everybody what your call sign KC actually stands for as an A10.
Yeah.
You were given it by colleagues.
Just for the record, we don't give ourselves our call signs. They're given to us. And mine was given on a Friday night. It's usually in a bar. It's a big celebration. You're not in the room when they tell stories about you. I was the only woman in the squadron, so I was a little nervous when I walked back in, and everybody's cheering and yelling, and they're like, "Your call sign is KC," and I'm like, well, that's really lame because those are my initials. I didn't say that out loud because that would not have gone well, but that's what I was thinking. And they said KC stands for killer chick. And I thought, all right, I can live with that. So
yeah, it's a great.
And then you fly with your call sign in combat and it's yours for life. So
yeah.
What would I go back and tell young KC? And I think, I've touched on this a little bit because I think it's so important, is that on your leadership journey, you will make mistakes, right? You will have failures. You will face rejection. Things are not going to go as planned. And I think we could do ourselves well if we gave ourselves some grace and know that these hard things are going to happen to us in general, we are going to come out stronger on the other side. It's really hard to see that in the moment, but you will become stronger, more capable because of the hard things that you face. But you have to be able to get back up again when you get knocked down. You have to be able to kind of dust yourself off and get back into the fight. And I think, I learned the resilience part of that because I faced rejection and mistakes and failure pretty early in my career. But I think I was still pretty hard on myself, and I didn't give myself that grace, and knowing that everybody's dealing with the same thing in a different way,
Yeah,
just being a little bit nicer to ourselves, I
I think
suppose.
so. That's a lovely one. I love that one. Um, Work-life balance and family.
Mhm.
You were married to a pilot who then, when he left the Navy as a pilot, he then flew for civilian airliners. You're both very busy with your own careers, and you have children. So these multiple roles, being human, you have multiple roles. Any advice and experience? Because so many people don't make it through that fire. I didn't in my first marriage. I'm now happily remarried to Lee, and we've got both busy careers, but it's working really well. Um, but I didn't learn the lessons. I mean, I've learned lessons now, but at the time I wasn't so smart about it. What is it that you find those who make it through? Is it just good luck, or is it actually a lot of hard work? What is
Yeah.
your tip to try and get that work-life balance?
Yeah. So my husband started in Navy pilot training, but ended up going Air Force. So we did have that going for us, at least that we were in the same service for the majority of our career. But we did spend a lot of time apart. And that time apart, I guess there was some goodness in that because we learned how to communicate really well. If we didn't communicate well, if we didn't kind of speak up about the little things that were bothering us, they could become big things later on. And so we really learned how to communicate well. The other thing that I found for us is because we were both working dual military, sometimes we would start looking ahead too far. And I get it is important to have these long-term goals and objectives and dreams and goals and all of that. But sometimes it can feel really overwhelming to look too far ahead. And so we found that if we could focus on just the next assignment, right? The next 3 years, how can we do that together? How can we support each other? How can we both have careers and continue to move forward? Just focusing on one assignment at a time, right? Just maybe 3 years at a time. That was very helpful for us because it often felt overwhelming to look too far ahead. And I think those are just, I think the term wingman is pretty good for us. We have supported each other. We have encouraged each other. We challenge each other. We have each other's back. We're also really honest with each other. When we ask for it, we give an honest opinion. And I think that's served us well.
Yeah, no, it's great advice. Well, look, congratulations on that. Before we do the top tip that you'd like to share with other people, what is one of the books that you found, a good recommendation? Do you want to talk about The Wisdom of the Bullfrog? It'd be quite good if you did.
Yeah, it's I guess ironic in many ways that Admiral McCraven is your next guest, at least in terms of timing. But his first book, Make Your Bed, helped inspire my book in many ways. He talks about if you want to, make a change in the world, these are things that you can do, which is a little bit of my book. If you want to lead with courage, here's some things that you can do. But I love his most recent book, Wisdom of the Bullfrog. I think there's so many valuable lessons. I love that there's stories, but there's lessons involved. He talks a lot about, getting out and connecting with your team and walking around and really finding out what's going on. And I think too often as leaders, we can get bogged down sitting behind a desk, getting emails done, getting the paperwork done. The reality is we will learn so much more about our team. People will connect with us more on our team if we can get out and walk around and building that time in your calendar. If a 4-star admiral can do it, then we can find time to do it too.
Yeah, it's a great book, and it's full of great wisdom. It's a leadership book like yours. So, what I'd love you to do is please introduce yourself, say who you are, give a little flavor of what you've done in your life. This is just a 2-minute top tip, which will stand in its own right, and share with us your top leadership tip. Cam, if you would, over to you.
Yeah. Well, I'm Kim Casey Campbell. I've spent 24 years in the Air Force as a fighter pilot and senior military leader. And I would say that the top thing that I have learned throughout my career is that we need braver leaders, more bold leaders, and courageous cultures. I think that we can all face fear and doubt and worry on our leadership journey. That's normal. It is all about what we do in the moment that matters the most. It takes courage to make decisions when we don't have perfect information. It takes courage to hold people accountable. It takes courage to show that human side of leadership and truly connect with the people on our team. And so we need to be able to do the hard things, embrace the fear, and lead with courage.
Yeah. What great advice. Well, look, Colonel Casey Campbell, thank you very much for being on the Inspired Leadership podcast. It's been an absolute joy. And I wish you every success in spreading the word and helping people to be inspiring leaders. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Bye for now.
Awesome.